Time destroys everything. These are the hauntingly nihilistic words that open Gaspar Noe's soul-crushing 2002 film Irreversible. From its first moments, Irreversible establishes an unrelenting sense of fatalism. Noe's film doesn't just tell a story, it dismantles it, stripping away the comforts of traditional narrative and leaving us trapped in a cycle of violence, grief, and inevitability. More than 2 decades after its release, Irreversible still divides audiences. For some, it's an exploitive exercise in provocation, a film that delights in its own brutality. For others, it's a masterwork of formal innovation, using structure and technique to illustrate the very nature of trauma. But what makes Irreversible truly remarkable is how its storytelling device, a reverse chronological structure, isn't just a stylistic experiment. It's the key to the film's emotional power. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's talk about what Irreversible is actually about. Irreversible is a French drama directed by Gaspar Noe, told in reverse chronological order. The film follows 2 men, Marcus, played by Vincent Cassel, and Pierre, played by Albert Dupontel, as they track down the man responsible for brutally assaulting Marcus's girlfriend Alex, played by Monica Bellucci. The film was part of the short-lived and very controversial New French Extremity movement in cinema. The New French Extremity was a wave of transgressive French cinema that emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It was characterized by its unrelenting depictions of violence, body horror, and psychological torment. Blurring the line between art house and exploitation, these films pushed boundaries with their nihilistic themes, confrontational storytelling, and extreme depictions of sex and gore. Drawing from horror, thriller, and avant-garde traditions, directors like Gaspar Noé, Alexandre Aja, and Pascal Laugier crafted works that challenged viewers both viscerally and intellectually. The movement often explored themes of societal decay, human depravity, and existential despair, making the audience complicit in the suffering it portrayed. While some saw New French Extremity as a bold reinvention of horror cinema, others criticized it for excessive cruelty and shock value. So, as you can see, Irreversible is basically all of that in a microcosm. The film's narrative begins in the aftermath of Alex's attack, showing Marcus in a violent rage, seeking vengeance. As the story unfolds backwards, the audience learns about the events leading up to the attack, revealing the devastating impact of time and fate. The film is notorious for its raw, unflinching depiction of violence, particularly the graphic assault scene. It also challenges traditional storytelling by using its backward structure to confront the futility of revenge and the irreversible nature of trauma. By unraveling events backwards, Irreversible forces us to experience violence differently. It denies catharsis, reconfigures character arcs, and, most disturbingly, replicates the way trauma fractures memory and perception. On today's episode of Deep Cuts, we're exploring how Noé manipulates time to challenge our understanding of cause and effect. We'll also be looking at why the film's structure is inextricable from its themes of loss, revenge, and the inescapable weight of past decisions. Storytelling, at its core, relies on sequence. The way we arrange events changes how we understand them, how we relate to characters, and how we emotionally process a narrative. Noé takes this fundamental principle and dismantles it. From Joseph Campbell's heroic journey to Sid Field's 3-act structure to Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, we have long been fascinated by how to structure a story. Stories follow patterns and rhythms. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Action rises, then falls, dumping us into a new equilibrium by their conclusion. It's basically been this way since cavemen started drawing on walls. This is no different in cinema. Most films introduce us to characters first, allowing us to connect with them before conflict arises. We watch as they navigate their normal world before hitting an inciting incident that takes them out of their everyday life and sends them on some sort of adventure. What makes Irreversible special is it does the opposite. We begin at the darkest point, the culmination of violence, chaos, and destruction. Then we're dragged backward through time, helpless as events unfold in reverse. The camera's manic, disorienting movement in the opening sequences, which would be the ending sequence if the story were told chronologically, mirrors our own confusion. By the time we reach the chronological beginning, the calm before the storm, the violence has already scarred us. This reversal does something profound to our emotional engagement. In a conventional revenge film, violence is often framed as a resolution, a moment of satisfaction. Think of Charles Bronson's Death Wish or Kill Bill. Revenge is often depicted in those films as righteous, necessary, and even triumphant. Those stories end with violence or revenge that makes things right. Again, giving the viewer a type of catharsis and putting us into a new world where order and righteousness have usually been restored. But in Irreversible, because we witness revenge first, the act is stripped of all catharsis. The brutality of the fire extinguisher scene, the pulverization of the skull of the man Marcus and Pierre think is Latenia, is simply unbearable to watch. This is not because we sympathize with him, but because it's so raw, so devoid of the usual cinematic cues that signal justice. We've been thrust into a scene of brutal violence with no real context. The typical narrative approach that would justify this brutality, or at least contextualize it, is nowhere to be found. We don't know who these men are, or why they're bludgeoning this man with a fire extinguisher. Later, when we learn why Marcus and Pierre were hunting Latenia, it doesn't retroactively justify what we've seen. Instead, it just makes it even more tragic. Their actions didn't prevent anything. They didn't rescue Alex. They didn't undo what had already been done. If anything, their rage only perpetuated the cycle of destruction. As the Confucius quote states, "The man who seeks revenge digs two graves." This is where Noe's structure becomes more than just a storytelling device. It becomes an argument about the nature of violence itself. Revenge is ultimately meaningless because it doesn't heal trauma. In fact, it often deepens it. By showing the consequence before the cause, Irreversible forces us to confront this in a way no traditionally structured film ever could. As Irreversible unfolds in reverse, the film compels us to constantly reevaluate our understanding of each moment. What initially presents itself as a brutal revenge narrative quickly morphs into a deeper meditation on fate, loss, and the irreversible nature of trauma. With each backward step, we're not just uncovering new plot points, we're being dragged into a reconsideration of time itself and how our perception of it shapes the reality we inhabit. This film doesn't just tell a story, it makes us question the very concept of causality, forcing us to see events not as isolated occurrences, but as part of an unbreakable chain of fate. By the time we reach the film's beginning, where Alex is healthy, vibrant, and full of potential, we're struck with a gut-wrenching sense of inevitability. There's a tragic awareness that permeates every moment that comes before the assault. Alex, unaware of the horror awaiting her, is trapped in a timeline we already know will end in brutality. Noe manipulates time to make the audience experience this moment as a form of tragic premonition, where the tension of knowing what's coming undermines the beauty of the present. The inevitability of cruelty looms over every scene, making us feel as if we are witnessing something precious that has already been doomed. And in this sense, the film becomes more than just a narrative of violence. It's a meditation on the fragile nature of time and how once certain events unfold, there's no turning back. If that were all Noe achieved with the story, it would be impressive. But the film's structure also affects how we perceive its characters. If Irreversible were told chronologically, we'd meet Marcus and Pierre as carefree friends before witnessing their descent into violence. But because we first meet them at their worst, drunk, reckless, and murderous, our initial impression is one of disgust. It's only as we move backwards that we see their humanity, their love for Alex, their joy before everything was taken from them. This inversion creates a sense of profound regret. It makes us long for a different outcome, even though we already know none exists. Time does destroy everything. Trauma does not follow a neat timeline. For those who endure it, past and present blur together. Memories surface unpredictably, triggered by the smallest details. Pain is relived, not remembered. And no matter how much time passes, the event remains irreversible. Noe's structure mimics this psychological reality. As we watch the film in reverse, we experience time not as a linear progression, but as a series of echoes, each moment reverberating through the past. The farther back we go, the more painful it becomes, because we know what the characters don't. This creates an unbearable tension in the film's final act, or in chronological terms, its beginning. Alex lies in a park, reading a book about time and fate, unaware of what's coming. The camera lingers on mundane moments, her smiling, Marcus playfully teasing her, the two of them enjoying a normal morning. Meanwhile, we, the audience, are trapped in the paradox of cinema, knowing the future while being powerless to stop it. Psychologists describe this as counterfactual thinking, the obsessive mental loop of replaying past events, imagining different choices, trying to rewrite the story. Survivors of trauma often fixate on the if-onlys. If only I had left earlier. If only I'd taken a different route. If only I'd done one thing differently, everything might have changed. Noe forces us into this same psychological space. When Alex decides to leave the party alone, we want to scream at the screen. When Marcus gets too high to walk her home, we want to shake him, shout at him, and warn him about what's going to happen if he lets her leave alone. And yet, we know it's futile. We've already seen the consequences. We've already seen how time destroys everything. Even the film's visual style reinforces this sense of irreversibility. The first half, or rather the last half chronologically, is shot in a sickening swirl of motion, the camera never settling, always in chaos. But as we move backward, the cinematography stabilizes. The early scenes are calm, natural, and bathed in warm light. The image quality itself subtly degrades as we progress backwards, reflecting the idea that the past is slipping away. By the time we reach the film's final frames of Alex lying in the park, bathed in warm sunlight, it feels like an illusion. The tragedy isn't just that we know what's coming, it's that the characters never will. Alex might think she's got her whole life ahead of her, but we know better. The film's reverse chronology challenges us to question our perception of control. The characters may believe they can alter the course of events, but Irreversible shows us that they are helpless, just as we, as viewers, are helpless to stop the tragic outcome that is already set in motion. It's a cycle that no one can escape. This backward structure seems to align closely with existential themes about time, fate, and free will. The characters are prisoners of time. The events unfold once and cannot be undone, making the film's exploration of irreversible violence all the more harrowing. As the characters move through their trauma, the viewer is forced to relive their journey, not just as an observer, but as a participant. Noe's use of time as an inescapable force underscores the existential nihilism that permeates the film. No matter how much we wish to change things, the past is gone. Time destroys everything, or as the Buddhists say, there is only now. In the end, Irreversible challenges us to confront the emotional weight of its story. It forces us to question the nature of trauma, the futility of revenge, and the relentless march of time. By the time we reach the beginning, where Alex is unharmed and full of potential, we are left with the overwhelming sense that fate has already sealed her future. The cruelty of time is inevitable, and there's no escaping it. This is where the true emotional impact of Irreversible lies, not just in its violence, but in the realization that time, trauma, and the search for justice are forces that cannot be controlled no matter how desperately we try. 2 decades later, Irreversible remains one of the most formally daring and emotionally punishing films ever made. It challenges our assumptions about storytelling, violence, and justice. It forces us to confront not just what happens, but how we experience it. The film is not just about brutality, it's about how time itself shapes the meaning of that brutality. It's about how violence, when stripped of context, becomes senseless, how trauma, when relived, becomes inescapable, and how memory, no matter how much we wish otherwise, cannot be rewritten. Most films offer closure, even tragedies allow for resolution. Irreversible refuses. The past is fixed, the damage is done, and the story is already written. Again, time destroys everything, and Irreversible makes sure we never forget that. Ready to take another deep dive into a cult film? Then be sure to check out my video on Caligula. You'll find a link on the screen. I'll see you guys over there.